Hello everyone, today we make our July episode about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I have this bi-monthly series that has been dragging for way too long considering the reason why we make it in the first place, or at least we could all do it ex post as a Schwerpunkt series after the end of the war. But as you're probably aware, sort of an increasingly large amount of black swans appears on the horizon at an accelerated rate, right? And this actually does not mean that there is any clear solution for the end of the war in sight. Actually, and this is what I would like to stress in today's video, is that the strategic fundamentals are de facto unaltered, which does not mean, of course, that the political, the moral one, and the other sort of the surroundings of the war also do not have a meaning. Of course, I not really started Schwerpunkt as a, at least contemporary strategic analyst. As you know, I'm a medievalist, and I reconstruct early 14th century battles for a living. That's what I do. Not quite for a living. I can't afford to do it even without a living. on basis of that, Schwerpunkt in any case does not represent my source of income, a major source of income either, of course. But the point being is that I arrived to this type of content much more gradually and for different reasons than other series. And fundamentally, aside from some videos I made about sort of relatively recent events in the history of warfare, the war in Ukraine is truly the only one that I, of course, decided to properly address in theory and with a very specific focus, in fact, on the expandability of not much of forecasts that sort of, especially within 4 months, stretch really do not change much the picture per se, but that can perhaps help sort of navigate the broader topic, given that especially there is an enormous confusion, I would say, not much because of the events that are actually pretty clear, but rather because of all the background noise that tends to sort of, or wishes or aims to alter the narratives or whatever, right? This channel has not even fully embraced propaganda myth busting proceedings whenever it came to even to point out the Ukrainian ones, like we did that anyway. In any case, today's video is dedicated to a topic that we had skirted around in the previous videos, and that resurges with prominence as far as you know, the substitution of Syrskyi with Drapati, all right, as the overall commander of the Ukrainian military. And this is not just an importantly political choice, but one that, of course, is going to have some strategic outcomes. And again, in spite of the obvious pro-Ukrainian position, I wouldn't say bias per se. The bias can just get in sort of through the lines as a narrative, not substituting the evidence, whatever is happening. This is what I learned by sort of wearing this new vest of strategic analyst by some degree. Looking at my counterparts around it, there is pretty sort of hot-headed kind of emotional, subjective approach to these topics from a side of those who should be probably the coldest, most objective, factually based, and sort of systemically immersed rather than narrowly agitated analysts, researchers in the field. I don't claim, of course, to be anywhere near the top, or again, I don't do this professionally, but I do have some background, as you know, in so to say kin subjects, and I think that any narrative is better reframed, because most of what I do for Schwerpunkt, as well as with history, is essentially communicating what we essentially know. If you buy books, if you go to libraries, if you really make the effort, actually you can learn history by yourself. So the sometimes certain topics that my own audience define as niche, right, are sort of macroscopically overly important, hyper-studied, and notorious. themes at least in academia. Whenever you start, if you start even at university, like, you will learn of the existence of at least in the first year of your education. And the point of any historical activity is always to revise at the end of the day, not for the aim of revising per se, but as a mean to an end, right? That is, it should be obviously based on some sort of basic objectivity. So the narrative is indeed important, and the more important it is as it correctly aligns with the moral and scientific evidence that we have at hand, right? There is no magic trick. There is no, at least on Schwerpunkt, I think I earned some reputation for objectivity, if not for impartiality. You don't need to be impartial in order to be objective, right? So this is not the point. This is not the point per se. But as we'll see today, we will make some statements that honestly I've not really listened, I have never really heard even around, and that sort of tend to in fact counterbalance in terms of certain narratives that I did instead hear on the contrary. This has a lot to do with politics and the connection with events of strategic direction. So I record on July the 23rd, by the way, so I usually record videos the day before. And so when we look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we obviously appreciate that it's continuing as a protracted war of attrition, defined by incremental Russian ground pressure in the Donbass, so the Donetsk basin, even while Ukrainian forces respond through technological adaptation, deep interdiction strikes, and significant command-level doctrinal development that prioritizes force preservation, especially now, as we will see this main topic of today's video, along with remote precision effects rather than manpower-intensive Soviet, post-Soviet style operations. If you're interested, years ago I made a video about what it means, so what does the Soviet, post-Soviet doctrine actually mean, and today we will have in part a way to look at it from a particular angle. The say probably up to the other day or so, the main narrative was, oh look, the Ukrainians that are bombing the various Russian refineries and depots and so on. It's not over. By the way, this was apparently it was a limited operation that, however, has definitely set like a standard for a much broader continuation and potential leverage. We'll talk about this. What does this mean in practice, right? Russia does not get simply obliterated by these proceedings. What you want to sort of achieve through that is just some general discontent. It seems to be even much more highly out there, and in this sense having well broken the taboo silence that for years the Russians maintained. And not because the Russians do not want the war to be won, on the contrary, but because they obviously realize the sheer level of sort of disaster this is taking, and also starting to affect their daily lives, like in the Russian, either Soviet, post-Soviet world. Like the mafia deal is, the state runs everything behind the scenes with a few people controlling most of it, and average people live like, of course, garbage life standards. But of course, as long as those are guaranteed, everything can work smoothly in that world of total corruption, of general sort of distrust, whatever. As we'll see now, Ukrainians made a splendid work during the same war, right, to go to war. And this is very important, even for today's topic in particular. It does align with political, and in the sense also military protection, for example, in digitalization, rendering sort of the entire workspace more efficient, more effective, also to in fact liberate more resources for the war effort. And so yet another great distancing of Ukraine from Russia, for that matter, also from a cultural, from a mental standpoint, that was obviously that already passed like the point of no return from quite some time. This is not per se the topic, but let's say probably the majority of you are expecting me to cover that sort of those attacks deep into the Russian Federation. We will do it at the end of the video in part, but it's exactly what you see, right? You should also better ask an economist what deeper effects this can will have, etc. I'm just going to tell you today we will be talking about something relatively peaceful, because my impression is that in the next few months something sort of much more sort of kinetic will happen, or at least something definitely more eventful, right? And we will partially explain now how or why that is the case. So this phase of the war highlights obviously profound asymmetries in strategic adaptation. War is always asymmetric by definition. Somebody's, trying to act cool, saying, conventional, symmetric, or unconventional, asymmetric, whatever. It's just, gibberish. Like it means something, but only by degrees. And war is always asymmetrical. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a war. Quite simply, this is maths as well as metaphysics. If you are, interested in that, we talk about it also in the Fangkrieg. These changes are, however deep, they are reflective of something much broader: command philosophy, operational tempo. In this context, Ukraine announced, as you know, the major military leadership shift on July the 21st and 22nd, when President Zelensky dismissed General Alexander Syrsky as overall commander and appointed combat veteran Mikhailo Drapati in his place. It's not that Syrsky, we'll talk about him now, obviously didn't have military experience. On the contrary, right? There is a debate in the last days when news circulated, regardless of who posts this, which aims, even from pro-Ukrainian voices, apparently pro-Ukrainian voices, but Syrsky actually is a hero, as we'll see now, at least he was decorated as such of Ukraine. He helped fighting the Russian invasion. He was successful in many instances. We'll understand now more deeply what the issue really is in terms of military criticism. That definitely is not lacking, right? Also, there is this tendency I notice in media to, in this war in particular, to, not only, but just because it's been more dominant, to extremize, right? In the age of social media, whichever news comes from going whichever direction, it's extremized toward that direction in absolute terms, right? And that measures, if anything, the level of either willful manipulation or willful ignorance that people have in anything that is actually happening over there. Is always the gold standard in many ways, right? Now, we'll also look at Drapati, who he is, etc. The decision, as you also probably know, emerged amid quite some discourse and even public protests in Ukraine, which is a message that alone is crushing what, by the way, the Russians are seeing, because all this is actually accessible by the Russians in spite of selective bans and censorship and so on. The fact that Ukrainians are, quote unquote, democratic. I don't like the term democratic because I think it's historically incorrect, politologically incorrect, but in any case, let's use it for the conventional way, are actually democratically asking government for changes, and changes arrived, right? A quite important one. So this is in and of itself already a, all another league of political awareness and level of growth of the Ukrainian nation that really is schooling hard the Russians, even on top of what has been happening on the battlefield, right, in these last years. All of this, however, presents some important feuds behind the scenes, and actually at the interior side of the Ukrainian state, that obviously is a post-Soviet one. And so much of what we were saying about the issues of Russia actually do reflect partially in Ukraine due to the shared Soviet history and beyond. Because indeed, the system is corrupt. The system is, what we know historically, like from the history of Ukraine in general. This is not so important per se, nor a problem even for say, the Western support of Ukrainian cause. If anything, like as we'll see now, it had been really highlighted by the same Ukrainians in face of certain decisions that reflected obviously some internal military frictions and clienteles and so on, ongoing debates, more importantly, over strategy. After nearly 2.5 years, I'm talking of Syrsky's command of full-scale war, and mounting tensions that reveal deeper divisions in military governance and reserves management. You know what happened with Zaluzhny in mid-war, and you know, in this sense, what kind of figure Syrskyi is. You know, a faithful of Zelensky, a friend of his, essentially, up to this point. And among the other things, and one of the reasons why Zelensky backed him, is that he was not essentially a politician in his role, right? Zelensky is sensitive to that, and this guy was a full rounded military man that had some, again, all those characteristics of, you know, post-Soviet countries, sort of deterior civil attitude, misunderstanding, trying to dictate, as we'll see now with Fedorov, like it's either me or him. You know, it's as if the Minister of Defense was, you know, that gives properly the governmental directions was a reproach or sort of responding to the commander-in-chief in the field, which is something very different on purpose. And obviously also stemming from personal issues that we will understand better now. Right, naturally, for a people at war like the Ukrainians, who suffered such staggering losses in relative terms, in any social, cultural, political, moral sense, these choices do matter very much personally. And with this participation, as with this public opinion that definitely has a very strong voice in Ukraine, and increasingly so, also due to this change. This is actually a very positive news. This strategic analyst that some of you probably know, that is Tom Cooper, who complained and lamented, of course, that this Ukrainian corruption and favoritism towards Zelensky's friends and so on for disclaimatory reasons. I haven't checked his page. I don't take much information from it in general. I mean, it's not like I dislike him as a person, but in general, I think that he pushes for narratives that I don't really like per se. I don't think they're really cool, and he could really, given his expertise, be much more on the piece, as he can be. He definitely can be. And in this sense, yet I think that there is a bit too much optimism. Also, in this case, my criticism to Tom Cooper and affiliates, and not in particular to him. I mean, affiliates meant like anybody who sustains that this is simply a univocally positive change. I do believe that it is positive, right? On paper, it does make sense. My point is that it's not necessarily going to solve the problems that people think they would solve. There is no magic miracle solver. The situation can be a great improvement, a good signal. I subscribe to that as well, but it's not everything. Let's also talk, in order to understand this better, about Drapati. Drapati was born on November the 21st, 1982, in the historic fortress city of Kamenets-Podilsky, that is in the Khmelnytsky Oblast. We also talked about it in our videos about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It's one of the places I really want to visit the most in Ukraine. Indeed, in fact, a location tied to Ukrainian defensive heritage on the frontier, southwestern frontier, with its ancient stone fortifications symbolizing resistance against historical invaders, and functioning as a cultural center as well. My heart beats fast when I watch pictures of that. Drapati graduated from the Kharkiv Institute of Tank Troops, an institution centered on armored warfare tactics, for which he's sort of more famous also for his iconic, famous blockade break, as we will talk about right now. And for that, also vehicle maintenance, command principles that indeed originated, at least in that frame, in the Soviet period, but was later adapted for Ukrainian needs following independence. Drapati began his service as a lieutenant in the 72nd Mechanized Brigade station in Bila Tserkva near Kiev, and accumulated extensive hands-on experience, started with the earliest phases of the war in 2014, with Russian-backed forces and regular Russian units seized portions of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts after the annexation of Crimea. And that is a bit of a forgotten part of the story. Also, as far as Syrskyi's capacities is concerned, because there you could actually already see what Syrskyi is about. These are two very different people, I would like to stress, in terms of character and nature. Syrskyi is much more of an offender, as we'll see now, an assaulter. he's very much sort of focused down the line, sort of striking precise points, but mostly being influenced in a sort of Soviet kind of style of doctrine. We'll understand now also why better. That already in that he did good things after 2022. That we'll list after, but in the first, if you want to call it like in the first war, indeed he lost an incredibly sort of avoidable amount of men in that sense. In this kind of nonsensical Soviet mentality that every time there is the enemy has seized a place, you have to immediately counterattack regardless of any other consideration. That's not how things fundamentally work. That's how he was schooled in the Soviet doctrine, but we've seen what the Soviet doctrine was designed entirely around essentially the sort of armored warfare maneuver in the wide fields of Ukraine ended up functioning like. Now, in 2014, as commander of the 2nd Mechanized Battalion, Drapati directed daring operations to relieve Ukrainian positions in Mariupol on May the 9th, during which his forces employed infantry fighting vehicles, including BMPs, that, famously enough, under his personal command, rammed barricades under fire to break through separatist checkpoints in the city center and free hostages held in the local police department. So that alone is a massive icon, right? Introduction card, so to say, about who Drapati is. That is considered a bit crazy, indeed, right? There is no doubt about this. He's a very different person. He's much more introverted, much more sort of Plutonian in a way, but also capable of these strikes that really mean something in that also martial capacity of knowing how to behave in such situations, right? So it's sort of, we're talking hard breeds here in terms of direct personal experience. Subsequently, Drapati carried out a successful breakout from its Varine encirclement near the Russian border, rescuing hundreds of troops and dozens of vehicles despite intense artillery barrages, minefields, and small arms ambushes that endangered Ukrainian columns withdrawing from isolated border positions. You don't want to be in such a situation. He districated himself and his men out of that pretty neatly. Now, Drapati is a 43-year-old tank officer who has essentially advanced into senior command roles, had up to this point was being naturally elevated to the top, having built, in fact, a reputation for accountability and pragmatic leadership as well. Right, his career rooted in direct field experience from battalion level upward, with intimate knowledge of trench realities as well, stands in sharp contrast to predecessors shaped more by peacetime hierarchies, as it is, in fact, mostly the case also from the Russian side. He previously clashed with Syrskyi over army reforms, particularly efforts to overhaul training and structure that faced resistance, reflecting a reformist orientation that stressed meritocracy. This strange thing in the post-Soviet world where, of course, merit does not exist because people are all alike, right? All miserably so, yeah, and all abusing, of course, of their power, right? It's a typical sort of dictatorial regime. Like, everyone is given that little space where to fully abuse of to compensate for the abuse that he regularly receives. And the problem with Syrskyi is that he, just also by character, etc., tended to hyper-control, to emphasize micromanagement, wanting to be, in fact, in control of everything, of every single figure, meddling with literally small unit deployment. So a vision that doesn't make much sense in any strategic fashion, like Western doctrine in many ways is much more, so to say, liberal, stressing the autonomy, the sort of the quality of the centralized command for being able to exploit certain opportunities and so on. There are pros and cons in this, right? But let's say advanced militaries in the world. NATO doctrine, of course, is the top possible example due to its magnificent integration of the sort of the strongest military force in the world from a very varied alliance of the finest militaries out there. But let's say in general, also through experience, they pick the U.S. doctrine per se. There is a much greater story. This is also what my avatar is about, like it stems also from Prussian warfare, for the necessity of maneuver, and so on. It's something which really is not much present. This maneuver per se is of course emphasized by Soviet doctrine, but not quite in the sense that much autonomy, much liberty is given to room for maneuver is given to the officers down the line, right? And so this was always the problem with the Ukrainian military, as much as the Russian one. I mean, the fact that the Ukrainians were already sufficiently westernized to cope with this invasion in the years in between the two wars. The Russians remain fundamentally unchanged in that, but the resistance also in the Ukrainian system to a greater opening towards something more dynamic has been a great problem since the beginning of the war, right? The Russians never understood where they had to stop advancing. The Ukrainians never understood when to stop defending. Well, those who understood the matter better and tended toward a much more elastic handling of the matter are Ukrainians. But indeed, as we will see now, Syrskyi is absolutely responsible for some of the most avoidable losses in this war that are not, say, just speaking about human life, right? But it's not entirely just about that. It's also about the value of human life for this particular country, in this particular situation, and in strategic management of the war, right? And we will make a counter argument to this as well in the end. That's why I was saying that what I'm about to stress is not overly intuitive. But the point is also, in fact, the same from the other side. The defensive is useless without a counteroffensive capacity. This is not to blame. It's not like Syrskyi or Zapata do not know this, respectively, in some way, or vice versa. All right. This is about the fact of we're talking either tactics or strategy, and the broader strategy, especially to win the war in this moment in the Ukraine, especially since mid-2023, after the unbreaking offensive on Zaporizhia, reduced itself to the defensive, right? And the only cases in which sort of an offensive posture was put out in the four wars fundamentally were premature, were a waste of resources in strictly economical terms, so to say. And the responsible for this was indeed Syrskyi in some ways. There are always, always pros and cons. So we'll try to circumstantiate this better. But this acquires a much broader meaning, so a political one, if you understand the difference that Zaluzhny, the previous commander-in-chief, had with Syrskyi. That was, in fact, a more defensive, comprehensive, strategic approach to especially what essentially is happening now with the drones that he had correctly spotted as a great deal of the response. Solution in this sense is complete, because it's not saying war has to be won with technology, right? And a risk in the current change is that maybe there is too much of an attention toward that, and not the situation on the field, the battlefield per se. Zaluzhny, in a complete fashion, is continuing obviously to influence this aspect, was prioritizing at that point mobilization efforts that, as you know, also were lacking, right? At the beginning of 2025, the end of 2024, there had been failed attempts at filling the gaps of the losses, various units in a equilibristic way, and basically Zelensky and Syrskyi mismanaged time, and they lost some terrain also because of that. Something, again, irrelevant. The Russians still haven't basically seized anything that you can say to be strategically meaningful, given the scale of the enterprise that they attempted to even start. And so what happened on the battlefield was not really particularly relevant from either side. Syrskyi was, however, as we'll see now, notoriously responsible for the reconquest of much of the eastern Ukrainian territories that had been lost, and we're talking full 2022. We'll get now better to that. And that gave him, indeed, quite a lot of prestige. For the rest, again, we'll analyze better what he had implemented as a general, probably organic and tactical force and capacity, and surely he knew his deal in that, but not necessarily at that level of scale that is so crucially needed to see the war in a more comprehensive and far-sighted fashion, right? So the contrast indeed with Drapati and with this Zaluzhnian school, so to say, had been evident, right? Besides, one of the interesting aspects of Drapati's appointment is that he had always and will, say, walk that path now even more, advocated for greater delegation, not just to subordinate commanders, but also fuller integration of nationalist-aligned units like Azov elements into broader decision-making to draw on their combat experience and motivation. Right, Azov had literally at some point openly criticized Syrsky and even refused to take part in certain operations, and this is true also for many other units and quite elite ones in the Ukrainian military. Now, in 2025, Drapati resigned as ground forces commander following a deadly training site strike in Sumy that killed personnel during preparations, an act that underscored his sense of responsibility before he turned attention to northeastern defenses. This is quite nice because he had taken care of these camps that he had deemed to be too brutal in the way Syrsky had been sort of quite sadistically operated them in a Soviet fashion. We'll explain now how, right? So a level of brutalization of records is always important. You have to destroy these people and turn it into killing machines, let's say, but say the level of oppression, like that there is this limit beyond which, indeed, you're just damaging the system and ruining it rather than having its full potential being expressed. So this is also very unique. Drapati could have simply remained in charge. Instead, he said, I take accountability. And he showed also politically that he is therefore not attached to hyperpower or whatever. This shift to Drapati that we're talking about today occurred already by February 2026 amid Zelensky's consultations with nationalist elements and reform-oriented figures while maintaining influence from figures like Mikhailo Fyodorov in technological and procurement areas. Fyodorov, we'll talk about him, is a pretty young man. He's, I think, only 35, and he was able to bring on the table a more rational organization of resources, a better handling, proper management of the subcontract mechanism, deals that were obviously the place where most corruption nested itself. And they were talking properly what could be squeezed out of the aids in terms of actual weapons that would be sent to the front. So there you could quantitatively address the scale of corruption that occurred. Is a good, say, 1/5 of the total, something. This meeting of Zelensky with these figures also addressed accumulated frictions from the prior period and signaled an embrace of the Zaluzhnian legacy alongside fixes for structural deficiencies from Zelensky's side. This was very important decisions because Syrsky had been really his faithful in many ways. Let's talk about Syrsky a little bit more. Literally Soviet-trained general, born on July the 26th, 1965, in a small rural village of Novinky in Vladimir Oblast of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic within the Soviet Union, coming from a military family. His father Stanislav served in the Soviet armed forces, and the family relocated when he was a teenager to Kharkiv in Ukraine, where he completed schooling before graduating from the elite Moscow Higher Combined Arms Command School in 1986. His early assignments included Soviet artillery units prepared for potential nuclear delivery systems, such as heavy self-propelled howitzers and rocket systems like the BM-27 Uragan. He served in Afghanistan, interestingly enough, during the Soviet-Afghan War and in Tajikistan and Czechoslovakia in the late Soviet era. Following the 1991 dissolution of the USSR, Syrsky transferred his loyalty to independent Ukraine. Admittedly so, took the oath to the new state and progressed through National Guard and Ground Forces ranks over the following decades. He earned the Hero of Ukraine title for orchestrating the successful 2022 defense of Kyiv against the initial Russian thrust toward the capital. you will all remember, coordinating the flooding of approaches through destruction of control of the Irpin River infrastructure that created natural barriers slowing armored columns in the Hostomel-Bucha-Irpin corridor. As you remember, there were literally corridors across nothing, like the entire Ukraine, right? While enabling rapid repositioning of assets from multiple directions to blunt the Russian attempt launched on February 24th, 2022. He also gained recognition for directing the lightning September 2022 Kharkiv counteroffensive that we're talking about before, which liberated approximately 8,000 square kilometers in under 2 weeks via well-planned combined arms maneuvers involving mechanized units, territorial defense forces, and special operations elements that capitalize on Russian overextension and logistical vulnerabilities. All right, that's also what triggered the Russian mobilization shortly afterward, because of course, that was the product of the collapse, right, that had occurred, and the Russians were, on the run in that sector that could not be held, just like Kherson. We'll come back to all this, to the various fronts in some detail later, right? Because this is still obviously an update. I normally organize these videos as, say, let's talk about a general topic in the beginning and then see essentially where we are on the ground. And this war in particular, it's not like too much is happening on the ground to begin with, at least of sort of, as I said before, strategically relevant, strategically relevant fashion. Speaking of the contributions of Syrskyi commanding the defenses around Kyiv with autonomous small units from training institutes and partisan actions, there is the ambush on the extended 64-kilometer Russian supply convoy north of the capital to disrupt fuel, ammo, and troop movements in the critical opening weeks. And so you have this interesting background where he indeed was capable and indeed anti-Russian in spite of his origins, and expressing exactly that 1980s Soviet doctrine focused on mass artillery, combined arms maneuvers drone, literally from World War II, like in the core of the experience and the design of the doctrine itself. Hierarchical command structures understood as very rigid, right, very inflexible, and looking at from the close, indeed, also what happened in 2014, and that where he actually did not perform particularly well, and already exhibited that sense of too much, never retreat, too much, let's make them bleed till the last minute, but without considering too much our own men in the process. Something that Ukraine simply in this war cannot sustain, at least. In fact, just for the record, Syrskyi is known as definitely Bakhmut's butcher by the Ukrainians, right? Which gives you an idea of what we're talking about. It's not like Bakhmut was not necessary there, but for example, the general mismanagement of the situation there between Syrskyi and Zaluzhny due to the various pressures that Zelensky had, in particular, to show that a new counteroffensive was possible, etc. Zaluzhny disappeared. I mean, during the preparations for 2023 offensive, it was definitely in disagreement. It was not so going public on that, but obviously signaling it in this very powerful way. You know that when Zaluzhny was sort of dismissed, so to say, they met with Syrskyi to show that we're friends for the unity for the sake of Ukraine. And so this went without blood, but let's say in general, there were deep tensions regarding the ultimate strategy and the possibilities of Ukraine to enact this or that, not just for a world show to look at. The 2023 counteroffensive, you can't really say that it was useless per se. Right, it did have a purpose that, admittedly, from the Ukrainian side, it did entail the possibility of breaking through, but that also had a wearing out effect from the Russian side. Losses were not much high in absolute terms from the Ukrainian side, but in relative terms they were, to the extent that that force could have been employed in a much better place, also in a much more reduced fashion. For example, had those armored forces being injected on the flanks of Bakhmut, where the Russians that had bottled themselves into the city fighting in a tunnel vision had failed to fortify, you could have literally reversed the entire Bakhmut, one of the bloodiest battles of last decades of warfare, and so destroy, right, a massive scale of Russian resolve, showing that all that had been really for nothing, right? Instead, you had everything that followed, and Syrskyi was managed to take over fundamentally. Other point we will look at, his tenure encompassed the controversial Kursk incursion of August 2024, which conceptually sought to shift the war center, not necessarily the Schwerpunkt, but let's say by initially seizing over 1,300 square kilometers, including areas around Zutsta, through exploitation of lightly defended Russian bordered zones previously viewed as low threat. And that, in fact, also the Russians said, okay, why would anyone have to attack here? It's not a problem. Now, the point is that there was a political point to that, showing in the face of the U.S. elections that indeed Ukraine was worth funding. And so showing initially that there was an important moral effect, right? Also in the narrative, if you remember, all the Russian propaganda at the time said, Ukraine is done for, it's falling. And these guys literally entering, like regular Ukrainian mechanized and air assault brigades crossing a surprise thrust and captured prisoners for potential exchanges. And everything in the moment definitely had an impact, right? Also in the general political fluctuations and ambiguity that Trump for the electoral campaign maintained. Yet, at the end of it, right, took forever for the Russians to retake those areas, and they took many losses in that. But the operation for Ukraine, because remember, the victory and defeat are always relative, right, to the actor, so to say. The operation for Ukraine did not compel meaningful Russian redeployments, for example, on other fronts, right? Instead, it produced disproportionate Ukrainian losses of high-value Western-supplied armor, such as Challenger 2 tanks from the UK, M1 Abrams variants from the US equipped with depleted uranium rounds, and Leopard 2 variants from Germany and other partners, equipment difficult to replace given constrained production lines, long delivery timelines, and political hesitations. So again, just like in Zaporizhzhia the year before, it's not like the thing was a disaster from the Ukrainian side, but they lost forces that from the Ukrainian side are more relatively difficult to replace, and or that had a particular value also as far as international observation of what did our tanks do and how did they end, like in this kind of operations, how did the Ukrainians behave in this? Did they simply consume these? Did they care about using them properly? So all mostly political issues rather than strategic ones that, however, all piled up could have had consequences. There are lots of similar issues that also weigh, for example, on the West. Let's not talk about from the Russian side because it's like shooting on the Red Cross, but let's say, I don't know, hesitating even just a month or two before sending artillery at the beginning of the war, like would have probably prevented the Ukrainians from seizing at least other hundreds of square kilometers in the 2022 fall offensive. Right, so all this must be considered. All what could was used equally in armored forces in Zaporizhzhia in 2023 could have been used around Bakhmut with much greater devastating effect. So Zaluzhny, in his view, it was much more peculiar in many ways, had sort of generally speaking understood how to manage the situation. He was definitely the best, the most qualified in order to continue to lead, but the political direction would not allow him. And in part, and indeed, in this sense, he was politically substituted for Syrskyi. That maintained this idea of bloody counteroffensives, or at least bloody counteroffensive also by the scale at that point the Ukrainians could afford after 2023. Just Kursk was the major one in scale, really. The other interesting aspect that I always like to remember is that in fall 2022, Zaluzhny had been proposing, and instead Zelensky and therefore Syrskyi's line surpassed the necessity of striking not in the east, not in Donbass, where admittedly, again, Syrsky succeeded, but in Zaporizhia, where indeed also the 2023 effort would have been launched. And a year after, he was not okay with launching it there, right? Because the situation had changed. The Russians had fortified. Indeed, this is debatable, indeed, and also I don't never like what ifs, but imagine this. Yes, again, we all know this has never been, in my opinion, too much publicized. Great success for the Ukrainians in fall 2022, but what if Ukrainians had attacked in Zaporizhia? I don't know, maybe it would have failed. We don't fully know. But in that circumstance, breaking that corridor, narrow corridor, arriving to the sea would have severed Russian connections with Crimea, with remaining forces in Kherson. It would have been a total disaster, a much bigger game changer. It may have even brought further escalation. If you remember, Putin was sort of at least consoling himself about using nuclear weapons. There is something sort of, in any case, inexpandable and incredible, say, in this, especially in this type of context, for a number of reasons that we also discussed at the time. Isolated, so brought possibly even to an end of the war, right? At least with an end to the war as we have seen it happening ever since, right? With a much stronger Ukrainian southern flank, possibility to harass Crimea before time. Seizing Crimea is another story, right? But still, essentially, bringing the Russians to concentrate much more from an eastern perspective rather than a southeastern one, creeping toward the north from there. This is not the point per se, but it's just for telling you how impacting these specific choices in command preferences really were. A reinforced opposition, including North Korean contingents, we're speaking of Kursk, estimated at 10,000 to 12,000 from the rogue country, often deployed in infantry assault roles under Russian command with confirmed combat engagements and casualties contributing to attrition of those same premier platforms. So saying the Russians said, okay, you want to do this in our territory, we send you, even the Koreans, the cannon fodder. We don't even address you per se. Again, this doesn't change the overall strategic. Every military action has a strategic relevance of Kursk. Just it was more like a political instrument, as always, to garner attention from the United States and showing the worthiness of investing in Ukraine. That, as we also predicted at the time, would have never lost American support whatsoever. It's simply not on the table. It's never, and it could not be on the table for all a series of reasons, strictly technical. It has nothing to do with personal opinion or political side. This is what people fail to understand, especially with all this sort of hysteria that we've seen toward Trump. And that's where a really strategic analyst seems to me to have lost the plot completely regarding so many different pictures. So you may debate, as we did also at the time, the actual relevance and worthiness of Kursk. Indeed, after sort of the meeting with Trump and everything that followed from that, the Ukrainians found themselves there, could not simply withdraw from Kursk, and so they kept taking these losses in their gradual retreat with further counterattacks that were favored by Syrsky. This is what brought to the irreplaceable high-end equipment that exceeded in Kursk Russian equivalents in key phases. As initial goals eroded under sustained pressure, glide bomb usage with the Fugasnaya Aviatsonaya Bomba, high explosive aviation bomb, glide bomb series. Munitions dropped from aircraft essentially outside heavy air defense range and other reinforcements, ultimately contracting the operation to small border pockets by early 2025 without delivering lasting strategic diversion or negotiation leverage while stretching Ukrainian reserves. And in a moment in which those were fairly stretched, to say the least, it was a problem, if you remember, that has been normalized also for all the people saying, but Ukrainians do not have men anymore. Everything is going, we're not to the end, of Ukrainian manpower in sight, and we already knew at the time as well, just for other obvious technical indicators that any person competent in this field should be aware of before even talking or thinking to talk, which would be even better. So what's the point here? Is that Syrski's approach, shaped by combined arms training and a preference for immediate counter-assaults before enemy mobilization, led to the creation and heavy use of dedicated assault battalions. This is his greater creation, often operating under direct high command oversight with personally selected commanders. These units, let's be honest, they actually are good. All right, it's not like they aren't good. Actually, he made a great job in creating them. The poor job is in realizing that they're not the kind of units that, albeit performing well in individual terms, in terms of military quality, are not used or usable in the strategy that Ukraine preferentially needs. We'll talk about this later, because all of this is slightly debatable, because there is this jump between politics and strategy that we also must understand better. So this creation of his drew criticism for overly centralized control, reaching to tactical brigade and battalion levels, as we were saying before, which is kind of also ridiculous. Frequent commander, because the commander-in-chief simply does not care about this stuff. It's not his business. If you're wasting time doing this, it means that you're not doing the right thing. And this is exactly the point. Syrski is just, von Clausewitz explains this very well. There's just a level of command capacity. In fact, it directly equates the hierarchy. There are some people who are very good at a very specific level. Every person, we brought in the military, has that top by person, by character, by experience, etc., and he should be employed in that level. If you give him too much, he's not able to take control of the situation, right? This is a famous issue. Think about Rommel, that was in many ways also overrated in this sense, in the face of much other great German commanders for him, not because he wasn't good in at a level where he excelled, in fact, but because he was projected something more that he really wasn't. At a point, there was actually no accountability for the commanders who failed, right? This is something that happened from the Russian side as well. During the war is typically Soviet. It's the idea that you don't actually purge commanders, right? Purges sometimes are actually pretty darn good as such in the military, not always. The Soviets know better for what they did before World War II, and it was the same Winter War in the meanwhile. And the point instead in this clientery space is that you don't really want to create too much problem to all these people. They have their own name, reputation, clientele, and so if they fail in some way, you just remove them from their command and you send them somewhere else, right? It's like the Russians, who change lots of generals, especially at the beginning of the war, all the time, every 2 weeks, so to say, just hoping that something would do, right? That's the level of desperation as well. And so the aforementioned rigidity, contrasting with the aforementioned Western models that instead emphasize subordinate initiative and mission command principles refined in NATO exercise in operations like those in Iraq and Afghanistan, simply did not belong to Syrski and for a while now, in fact, Ukraine's strategy and military doctrine. And of course, even if there is a lot there, because it's a massive army and it has, in this sense, so many different opinions and voices and autonomies for that matter, also because of the system that you just delineated now, is not the best, right? It doesn't speak a unitary language. This is for the concentration of command, the strategic effectiveness really detrimental in part. These were the great problems, right? That all military analysts at a more sophisticated level advocated for the fixing of, right? And all this brutal post-Soviet culture, there are also scandals in Syrskis management of, for example, non-commissioned excesses and bullying, inadequate preparation resulting respiratory illnesses from poor equipment and prolonged exposure in muddy trenches and substandard winter camps lacking sufficient heating and medical support. This is just like mentality, okay, they don't really give a damn about you. You're replaceable. Your sole purpose is to fight and die for the motherland. There's all this massive legion and myth, this sheer brutality and thuggery. You just go for it and you win the war, essentially. That's not how you actually win a war. You have to devise something more comprehensive, right? Giving a good beating, like putting under like records, brutalizing. To an extent, it's completely fine, right? There's a limit. There's a precise limit where that doesn't happen. Right, when you enter the military, the first and most important thing is to learn that whatever you think has no value whatsoever. When you are at the lowest level, you must be destroyed as a human being and completely rebuilt as a purely killing machine. Right, and only then, when you learn how to slaughter people en masse, you learn how to do it better and grow muscles in that direction and rise over the hierarchy, and you become a wise man. Right, and if you are able to handle more and more, right? But when this becomes just like a rigid system, a sclerotic, corrupt one, clienteling one, with also poor, with no meritocracy for that matter, because in this system there is no way, in fact, to rise adequately for merit itself. It's all based on connections, on this clientele, of mob mentality, etc. This is not good, right? This is what truly separates the tribesmen, the savages from actual civilizations, from actual states, like from the top-notch militaries that are there. And there is definitely a cultural, civilizational deficit here at play. And I mean, having lived in the Soviet Union is not a normal thing, right? It's not normal. In a neurocognitive sense, a person, even there is a transgenerational trauma to this, right? There's a staggering level of mental illness, something that is etched in your genes. It doesn't end there, right? This is also the pious hopes of people to think that it's completely normal to deny. It's the first answer always of the post-social, to deny that socialism even existed or that left a trace. And everybody from the outer side perfectly sees that. But it's not an opinion. It's not really debatable. Communism is directly proportional to the absence of human dignity. Just for telling you here, there were literal mines placed near training perimeters. If somebody escaped, would blow up on them. That's the degree of it seems like the bad guy plot for a Steven Seagal movie, like those B-series ones that he still produces apparently by himself. And certain characters in place by Syrski. Let's also speak of the personal level, or objectively disgusting, will now make some name. But the great strategy obviously happened on the front line, right? High casualties, difficulties balancing attritional demands against manpower constraints from demographic declines, rotation limits, and pervasive drone surveillance that rendered mass movements highly vulnerable to real-time targeting by inexpensive commercial quadcopters and loitering munitions. You can't really enact that level of perennial counterattack when literally the battle space is contended by something that can simply destroy those attacks per se, and that you're literally also founding your overall strategy still, because counterattack is not the only strategy. You have to stop at some point, you have to defend. And you have been slaughtering Russians in biblical quantities, just successfully so doing that. Why would it go better for you, right? And especially like considering that you do have manpower research. So this is a moral, personal, cultural deficit of Syrski's, right? It's not. And this does not raise his competence, otherwise in creating pretty darn good assault battalions, but that cannot be spent. So therefore, this is a deep shortcoming, short circuit, so to say, that, after 2 years and a half of a full-scale war, you should have fundamentally understand under your command. But it's deeper than that. It's really about the system, the clientele and more. One of the despicable individuals are, for example, figures like Valentin Manko. This was to say that it's controversial colonel, but as well as hero of Ukraine for that matter, awarded in 2024, naturally under Syrski, elevated to head assault troops. And this I mean, it's even useless when we to talk about him, but he had roots himself in 2014 volunteer battalions, including the Ukrainian Volunteer Corps and later command of the 33rd Assault Regiment. Manko's flamboyant public displays, including unredacted map photos shared on social media, triggered operational security investigations and ridicule from peers as well. One of already that has those kind of dogs and, tells it all. Like, that's directly, those abortions of, monsters of nature that we artificially created, that mirror the cerebral capacities of certain individuals indeed. And this is criminal. I mean, people are dying because you're fucking stupid, right? That's the level. You just look at the guy and say, well, okay, we know essentially what this is fundamentally all about, right? The Latins had a beautiful expression, facies omnia dicit, right? And that's exactly everything I will say. So you understand that there is a properly ugly side of Syrski's policy here. Policy before strategy, and this occurred against a backdrop of prior scandals involving alleged misconduct, volunteer battalion controversies, criminal probes from the 2014-15 period related to property issues in the anti-terrorist operation zone. Other aspect that actually has come up lately again, and there we should open a massive parenthesis on the subject, but I'm not sure we can cover everything in a single video today, is the failure that occurred at Krinky. This was the bridgehead experiment on the Dnieper's left bank, if you remember, near, in fact, Krinky in Kherson Oblast, where poorly prepared marine elements from brigades such as the 37th and 38th suffered unsustainable casualties under leadership accused of butcher-like management across late 2024 into mid-2024. This was actually a massive Ukraine, except not massive in the sense that, again, in scale, considering the scale of the losses of the war in general from both sides, but definitely a massive catastrophe. Also, probably from a moral point of view, right? Ukrainian investigative sources later confirmed hundreds of identified dead and nearly 800 missing in action. 788 reported missing in action from October 2023 to June 2024. Per police data, specifically, with bodies often unrecoverable from the river or contested zones due to intense fire and logistical challenges, transforming a hope for a southern foothold into a stark symbol of attritional costs under drone artillery dominance. This is exactly the reason, I will not overly digress in this, but why the aforementioned hearsay regarding the Ukrainians now want to attack Crimea, that's not what they're looking for. There are some good units there that are, in theory, ready to do stuff. Like, it's important, especially in a climate that could potentially escalate. In a moment to another, you have to be ready. But the idea that Ukraine Ukraine at this point can retake Crimea, I've always said it. Crimea can be retaken, right? At some point, especially if the Russian army was to collapse for whichever reason. Of course, you can. It's not like the place defends itself by itself, right? Everything can happen. But in the moment, what the Ukrainians really want is to put pressure on Crimea with the Azov Sea blockade, effectively targeting just the bare minimum, hitting rudders or probably the command chambers of tankers. Very successful activity that, as you know, occurred in the last weeks with great success. Just right enough to create this blockade and emptying Crimea of Russians. That's also why they didn't destroy the Kerch Strait bridge. They want Russians out. So if at some point Ukraine were to retake Crimea, there will be less of an ethnic issue with the Russian component, right? But at the moment, right, there were some little robots that were sent on the Russian coastline, but they're more like a passive threat, right? And especially now with the change at the top, like the Syrskian strategy will not be pursued because that would become like simply a killing zone in the moment in which there is no place where to take over as well, with drones everywhere. How the hell do you even establish a foothold there? And what for? Like, There can be incursions maybe and go back and forth, cause damage, and then oblige Russians to bring troops there, a diversion. But considering the scale, what is happening in the rest of the front, this is not important. It's more important to be a looming threat and being definitely able to having a plan to sort of isolate Crimea and to eventually even land in some parts. There are plans for this, but this is not the right moment for doing so, nor it's anywhere imminent, right? There is probably no point. And again, in today's video, we do not look at that in detail, but there are also here very specific technical reason for it. Now, this is Sersky in essence. This command philosophy stood at odds with earlier strategic assessments advocating a transition to active defense that Zaluzhny strongly advocated for in a more comprehensive management of the war, much more broader vision that he only had in this space in this war at the moment. After, indeed, the 2023 counteroffensive showed exactly the point, like the dense Russian minefields in Zaporizhian sector, drone-adjusted artillery, layered defenses that restricted gains despite Western equipment inflows, right? And relatively light Ukrainian losses overall, over in the Russian defenders. It took really lots of losses. Zaluzhny warned in his February 2024 CNN interview and subsequent writings that a small force cannot succeed in a traditional attritional contest against a larger opponent without emphasizing personnel preservation via active defense. Earlier mobilization, when voluntary enlistment outpaced processing capacity, and morale was still high in initial phases, and a technological shift toward drones, digitalization, and remote warfare to offset numerical inferiority. This makes a lot of sense in a provisional way. This is what I would like to stress. I've always liked Zaluzhny in many ways. I think that he was really qualified for the job. I really like his attitude, his way of thinking. I don't know, I particularly vibe with a person in a military vision. I think that he obviously knows much better than me what should be done in that sense. I hope, by the way, meaning that, not that I'm belittling my own strategic capacity, but jokes aside, I truly mean it. Like, Zaluzhny's removal after voicing the defensive posture and calling for systemic changes illustrated too painfully how initial political reluctance to accept positional stalemate, though later developments affirmed his assessment. He was right, fundamentally. Many people, and this is the point, is especially these younger elements, these Zaluzhnyans, do not have the necessary strategic vision or competence, not even their path per se, to fulfill that vision. People fixated with drones, like in the information space, it's all about drones. It's all about this capacity to attack. It's what Ukraine is doing is perfectly fine. It's perfectly getting somewhere, right? It doesn't mean that it's going to be definitive. And in many ways, of course, this is still a war that is locked in a at least balanced stalemate that can't simply be unlocked even by this push or another, whereas it even the pretty heavy losses in resources, in economic, say, impact, etc., from the Russian side. There is a moral dimension that eventually finds solution that pushes for new ideas, right? We see here that everything is changing to a degree. Probably how much can change in a single war will also end. And this is the point, that the news flash you with, this factor is now important, now this other is instead. But the core of this war is, as always, Clausewitzianly political in a way that nobody has really found an answer to, including the one of escalation, right? Now it seems that in the Duma corridors, literally, people are openly speaking about, considering all how many spies exist, and recordings and so on, about taking Putin out, right? At least this is stated publicly by characters with millions of followers within Russia, so they're not censored, etc. So it's an incredible situation. It shows all Russian weakness in so many ways. So the solution is always going to be political in the end. The solution can't be strategical in the longer run, or to have a meaning that is simply strategical, right? It could pass through that, but true, obviously, that more comprehensive wearing out of resources. The problem is also what is happening on the field. Not much that Ukraine is losing particularly territorially much in a meaningfully relevant way, but this is attritional warfare. And so while the 40 days Ukrainian bombing campaign is working, still the end of the war is pretty far, right? Nobody really knows how this is actually going to end, right? And what kind of potentially escalatory maneuver, especially in front of Russian resolve, the losing side could take, right? Besides, back to Syrskyi a little bit, there is all the issue with Fedorov as well. But just, for example, in public opinion, he attributed to himself, like to his sole leadership, downplaying the contributions from territorial defense forces, volunteer battalions, and spontaneous civilian enforcement, logistics, intelligence, and local resistance, the successful defense of Kyiv in 2022. And Ukrainians did not like that, right? This further alienated civil society and media outlets like the Ukrainska Pravda. It was pretty vocal against Syrskyi. In Ukraine, there is definitely a wide political debate. And so this ouster is particularly important because it served as a reassertion of civilian primacy over military autonomy. Ukrainians decided this, right? Averting any potential drift towards, for example, Russian propaganda claims that Ukraine is a militarized state where generals might issue ultimatums to elect officials or because they're friends with the president is corrupt. This debunks it all for that matter. Not that there had even been a doubt at some point, but this is definitely an important, positive step, right? Speaking of Fedorov that we said before, and so the transition here, because this was triggered by Fedorov's removal. Fedorov, as we said before, is pretty young. He was born in 1991 in Vasilivka, Zaporizhia Oblast. It's a region, as you know, broadly speaking, connected to Ukrainian industrial and agricultural heartlands. Previously, Fedorov worked as a digital transformation architect who founded a social media marketing agency before launching the DIA app. As the youngest minister in Ukrainian history, he applied innovations in digital governance, such as streamlining bureaucracy through home delivery of documents and licenses to minimize corruption opportunities to military domains. This included open tenders for 155mm shells that reportedly reduced prices around $1,000 per round. And you know how many of those were shot, by the way, with substantial... This was the cost of corruption, as a matter of fact, with substantial savings, along with competitions for hundreds of thousands of medium-range attack drones that drew dozens of bidders and delivered notable cost reductions of pretty substantial section, 1/5 to 1/3 of the wall. So this is the guy that definitely worked a lot for the technologization of the Ukrainian military effort, for the drone policy. And so following Zaluzhny, following many other figures in the military and in the civil war that were definitely pushing for that, seeing immediately also what the drones had in potential. We made lots of videos about, also in the previous episodes, of Ukrainian drone potential and power and how they're reaching there. By the way, it's not like the Russians are sitting there and they can't escalate. But of course, the Russians are blind. They do not have, they have GLONASS that sucks. Ukraine has a massive Western support to a sort of surgical level. We've seen it with the strikes on oil refineries. There is really something really insane in terms of the capacity of Ukraine to lay Russia waste, showing how naked this really is. The SAM batteries are ending, are literally, and like at this point, Moscow is the most protected area, but the Russians simply do not have the capacity to replace this in a sustainable ratio. The Ukrainians have been hitting this over and over again. So the vast Russian territory is being ravaged in the way that we've seen. And this is just the beginning, right? We've seen oil refineries, but it doesn't mean that it will stop to that. There are some ducts that are tying like entire enormous regions of Russia just in single points that you can see literally from Google Maps, and everybody can target. And that actually probably Ukrainians are waiting for striking that's why we'll start seeing very interesting things in next months, interesting in the Chinese way, so to say, and so also risky escalatory, where at this point, this winter, it's the Russians that may start suffering the cold, because a hit on those infrastructure literally will bring to major disruption the entire Russian energy system, and it's going to be utterly insane. As we'll see now, already enormous damage was caused by all of this. It's just the beginning of it, and that's how vulnerable Russia really is. So, again, indeed, Federer fought against corruption. For example, earlier internal state lists had favored certain suppliers with high margins, often tying to non-resident owners or opaque networks. Yes, this is a shady sort of post-Soviet context, but they are fixing that. And Fedorov is exactly responding to, given the popular acclaim toward him, to that Ukrainian desire, the decisive moral majority of Ukraine for reform, for modernization, for innovation, for efficiency, meritocracy. And so this is really the great growth of the Ukrainian nation toward incredible horizons. Fedorov's data-driven scoring system directed most acquisitions of the aforementioned corrupt mechanisms to top producers per category that were augmented by open bids. You have the Brave One marketplace enabling frontline units to access hundreds of domestic systems rapidly through e-points earned from verified combat results. So an incredibly advanced level of sophistication. As you know, also the Western militaries do not quite have in certain aspects of the wielded by the Ukrainian military at this point. These processes redirected funds to tens of thousands of additional rounds via transparent mechanisms that eliminated prior high margins of 200-300% even on certain components by excluding non-competitive entities and adding verification, thereby enhancing frontline quality and volume despite finite overall stocks. This starts looking, even if so from a bureaucratic, administrative, managerial standpoint, definitely what is systemically needed from a civilian, in fact, background, like the one of Ministry of Defense, to sort of to address the broader matter, to allow for properly a strategist, a commander-in-chief, dealing with the war situation to take the right military moves. And you can see how Ukraine has already been moving toward this from several months now, right, and more. There has been an incredible scaling up, right? Nobody up to that point had thought that, for example, the current attacks on Russia could sort of scale so quickly and so disastrously for Putin and the Russians as well. So something new, right? Compensating for demographic and industrial asymmetries given Ukraine's position against Russia's larger population base and state-controlled heavy industry. This emphasis on remote, digitalized operations and leverage unmanned systems to really help all this happening. The question is Drapati capable of doing this? Because we don't know this. Right, his own appointment aligns with what we've seen before for his actions in 2014, the armored breakthrough in Mariupol, and this willingness to assume responsibility for setbacks, supporting institutionalization, merit-based adjustments, and technological integration. He served as a staff for the 30th Mechanized Brigade in the 2010s, coordinated the defensive operations along the Donetsk front. He commanded the 58th Motorized Infantry Brigade to sustain Donetsk operation around Avdiivka, and the Bakhmut Highway from 2016 to 2019 would focus on infantry mobility and local counterattacks. He led operational groups in Kherson that halted Russian advances toward Kryvyi Rih in 2022, by organizing defensive lines along the Inulets River and coordinating during a successful right bank liberation that fall. Right, he helped stabilizing the Kharkiv front in 2024. Right, so definitely a competent person by background, by experience. right? Now, in the enactment of such higher strategy, we don't really or necessarily know. He was in this sense chosen because he belongs to the so-called Zalushny, and let's call it this way, front, right? And so he is in line with the political direction that has now seen achieving, in fact, consistent results, the support of the Ukrainian people, strategic success against Russia. The pairing with the new General Staff Chief Major General here, Skibyuk, a trusted partner from the 2022 Kherson liberation, where joint planning overcame the Dnieper River challenges and Russian logistical vulnerabilities, aims to emphasize offensive actions across domains, rare strikes, and technological integration while keeping frontline pressure as well. We have no broader way to tell by now, but we assume that in general, like, the system is also really the system. So a leader is crucial in this, but this is not merely like a dictatorship of a warlord. So indeed, Ukraine did prove to be able to handle the current situation, to make this important change. It had been probably the hardest to make in a political, internal, sort of domestic political sense. And that is probably also going to create some further resentment, because the clienteling system that we outlined is not simply staying there silent. There are factions still within the military. So we'll see what happens. Nothing seems to sort of bring to a major break. The already experienced dismissal of Zaluzhny is sort of an indicator that Ukrainians obviously know, right, what's the post at stake, so to say. Right. I don't use maps anymore in the video because they stopped using the say copyright available ones for commercial purposes, in particular the Creative Commons, and I also like to conceptualize more. But if you, of course, there's plenty of accurate, detailed maps of the current front line. Some are sort of more accurate than others. There is always the problem of contending this or that area. It sometimes can create problems, but the advances from the Russians and any change territory at this point is so small that we're always where we have left also from the other times, right? The Russian forces maintain a grinding initiative in the Donbas, advancing incrementally toward key hubs like Pokrovsk, Konstantinivka, and the Sloviansk Kramatorsk agglomeration, the strongest fortress belt of Ukraine. That will take forever. Like, the Russians are setting this up. By November, we'll have conquered all Donbas. Yeah, good luck with that. It's going at this pace. It's going to take decades, right? And we're not really joking, right? It's like there was no major summer offensive, right? So we don't understand also how this should happen, given that the Russians are gaining increasingly less in this sense, and without any major force. And that's why also the mobilization has been invoked and planned probably already to be set for September, right? Things are definitely not looking good at all. And this advances continue at high cost with limited consolidation owing to Ukrainian defensive depth that at this point is pretty well consolidated. Ukrainians do not have an enormous amount of manpower in the enormous frontier, just like the Russians. So it's very difficult to press. Like, at this point, nobody presses on the entire front, right? There are probably no troops from either side to do that. This is a much more limited grinding attrition, also due to drone warfare as well. But the Russians are the ones on the offensive, and therefore sort of getting more losses, and also with some technical disadvantages that amplify them. In the northern sector near Vovchansk, they have used small infiltration groups exploiting forested cover and buffered zones to probe lines. This is really a tactic reminiscent of earlier Kharkiv fighting in 2022, where terrain supported covert movements over large armored pushes vulnerable to javelin missiles and artillery. But we are really pretty distant from those times. These infiltration efforts persist along flanks and buffers, tying down Ukrainian brigades without decisive breakthroughs, while sporadic strikes on Sumy infrastructure, including fiber optic drone hits on storage facilities within plausible range, signal attempts to disrupt near logistics amid forested terrain, aiding covert approaches. In fact, given that the front line has become ever more porous in general, it's somehow easy to advance troops that can use these fiber optic drones have a few tens of kilometers of range, right? So you realize that there are some pockets that advance, sometimes also just to take a picture from drones with the guys down below to show, look, we are actually here, but it's not a meaningful military unit, right? So yeah, you're in enemy territory, but you haven't captured anything. You have to actually go back home quite quickly to your front lines, because otherwise enemy drones is going to take you down otherwise, right? And Russians, for that matter, always go here by trying to outflanking, right, for different reasons, like trying to interdict the logistical lines and supplies to specific centers, but because they do not have the manpower, the capacity probably to take on the Ukrainian fortifications frontally, right? And this adds to the slow pace but also to loss, because outflanking an enemy in this sense is not it's apparently easier, right? But it also molds the battlefield accordingly, and so there is no easy way out of there. You have to perform these maneuvers with less troops to go more slowly and so on. Further south, intensified activity around Sloviansk and Kramatorsk involves Russian moves toward elevated terrain near Mykolaiivka and Yurkivka positions that provide line-of-sight benefits, especially for drone operators targeting lower-lying urban centers within Ukraine's long-standing so-called fortress belt in western Donetsk. This interconnected network of urban and ridgeline fortifications, developed over more than a decade, as incorporates trenches, minefields, dragon's teeth, concrete barriers to impede tanks, and industrial structures leveraging higher ground for river obstacles like the Siversky Donets for layered defense. So it's not just drones to do that, but the fact that the Russians are approaching these heights and are, in this sense, facilitated at hitting and seeing from the above, growing accustomed to the area, equates to sort of Ukrainian defenses being very gradually, but still importantly penetrated. Altimetric details show Russian proximity to higher elevations, while urban centers sit in lower zones susceptible to enfilade fire as well. Not enormous heights. Again, this is not massive tactical blunder, let's say, but at the same time, like visibility and drone strikes are facilitated by this. Ukrainian forces have adjusted with withdrawals to more defensible ridgelines and canal-linked fortifications. They have the advantage of this immense territory, after all, and so there isn't really too much in between. These areas are becoming more strategic, at least for the Donbas Ukrainian defense belt. They have prepared all these kill zones, like layered obstacles, to channel attackers into areas optimized for anti-tank guided missiles and drone dropped munitions. Geolocated Russian strike footage from mid-July depicting engagements against Ukrainian infantry in the contested pockets within around Konstantinivka confirms ongoing fluid consolidation rather than full consolidation. For anyone who followed the war in the past years, you have to understand how those fights work. Like the Russians say, oh, but we conquered the whole thing. And then the Ukrainians say, oh, look, we have troops here. And the point is most obvious. Yes, that mostly, especially from a Western perspective in our media, there's always the pro-Russian idiot that says, well, Konstantinivka is already fallen. You can easily check Russian military bloggers, right, that tell you that it's not the case. They're hitting with drones in certain very central parts of the city. That's definitely not a place that they can claim to directly control, right, at least, right? So we're not even here digressing on all things that have been circulating online, including some briefing the Russian High Command with maps that show, for example, like 20 kilometers ahead positions, Russian positions, compared to the ones they actually have, because of this quote-unquote contested area and wishful thinking. And somebody wonders even does put in notes this. What kind of information does he receive, right? The guy does not use the internet by his own admission. He was evidently misguided in the invasion of Ukraine by a big level. Let's say we know practically nothing about this, but the doubt arises, right? In these contested areas like Konstantinivka, Ukrainian counter-infiltrations and drone responses continue in central districts and residential areas, despite, again, some at least Russian claims of control weeks earlier even, right? Russian advances proceed at slow rates of tens of meters per day amid fierce urban combat, like the ones we were habituated to ever since the beginning, actually, of the campaign. If you think about the same Mariupol, but most famously Bakhmut, and many others that we've seen here, Avdiivka and so on. Comparable patterns mark Chasiv Yar approaches contested for over 2 years. Right, that's literally how long this is going to take at the current pace that is slowing, by the way, from the Russian pace. So it's unbelievable. Again, yes, this is a war of attrition, but this tells you by how much, how properly aimless the Russians are in expendable strategic terms at this point, right? It's really incredible. All right, you have gains measured in mere kilometers despite heavy efforts by Russian airborne units from divisions like the 98 that specialize in rapid assaults but also incurred significant losses in urban terrain. And they are advancing also toward Drushkivka and Vasyutinsk, where momentum meets interlocking defensive networks built over extended periods plus flanking actions. In the Pokrovsk axis, Russian expansion from Rodinsk toward Shevchenko occurs as Ukrainian forces construct secondary and tertiary defensive lines rearward with enhanced anti-drone capabilities, including electronic warfare jammers and physical barriers. Ukrainian mobile elements, notably elite parachute and air assault brigades, concentrated around Velika Novozilka, Ivanivka, and toward Komar and Uliapole, apply flanking pressures that force Russian resources diversion across wider frontages, disrupting consolidation from Vuhledar directions or potential breakthroughs toward Orehiv. These spoiling operations erode logistical corridors and prevent clean linkages between southern groupings, converting potential advances into contested zones needing constant flank protection. And this is what we were saying before, that the front line can't be both armies are stretched across the front line. So in this case, there are very good Ukrainian forces that are guarding in these areas, and that they have the task of potentially wedging into the various gaps that the Russians, by taking different directions, may open at some point. This is, again, very gradual movements. They both know what they're doing from years in the same way. So again, there's nothing surprising can emerge here. If you have an idea of the intensity of this fight, it's not like in the interest of the individuals that participate into it, it's not intense, but let's say they are, sort of strategically speaking, very, very modest, or at least rather modest, considering what the objective of this world war should be in a strictly strategic sense. Southward, concentrations of Ukrainian marine units near Melitopol and Kherson Oblast approaches, including the 30th, the 34th, the 39th, and the 40th Brigades, specialize in amphibious and riverine operations with reposition command elements, indicate possibilities for, as we hinted at before, limited raid activity along the Kinburn, Spit, and Dnieper adjacent zones in low-lying, sparsely vegetated salines and estuaries. Such operations favor remote or small-team insertions using drone-delivered markers for targeting, surface unmanned vessels for reconnaissance and strike, and hit-and-run tactics instead of fixed lodgements, drawing lessons from prior exposed beachheads lacking cover in saline marshlands and low-visibility terrain that proved expensive, as well as from crinky experiences that we highlighted before. Right, so there is not really much that could or would be done. Like, these forces are there in a preemptive fashion. They are the ones that are properly trained for that kind of amphibious warfare. The goal at most remains harassing garrisons, the Russian garrisons from the other side, right, interdicting supply lines to Crimea via the Kerch Strait and land routes, and heightening perceptions, at least, of vulnerability without committing to unsustainable bridgeheads under Russian artillery and air observation, while testing response times as well, because if at some point the invasion of Crimea has to take place, of course you want to remain aware of what more or less the enemy capacities are and what you could do in theory also in the moment. That's sort of a Kriegsspiel that you have to be able to play for any kind of strategic assessment and also for general military intelligence to evaluate and the think tanks for whichever purpose could ever arise. So passing to a bit of a broader situation, what pertains to the Ukrainian DIP operations. The latter have obviously grown markedly in scope and impact through coordinated long-range drone and missile campaigns that have struck Russian oil refineries, pumping stations, and power facilities across areas like Krasnodar near the Black Sea, Samara in the Volga region, Volgograd along the Don River, and deeper into central Russia. These actions caused temporary shutdowns of substantial refining capacity equivalent to hundreds of thousands of barrels per day, triggering fuel price spikes affecting civilian motorists and military logistics, and creating strains forcing reliance on imports plus domestic rationing via state distribution control, systematically diminishing Russian refining capacity. We don't need here to explain the international fallout of all of this, right? There is something twistedly satisfying about sort of the Russians needing to import oil in order to function and risking now to be also without major properly energy resources for example heating in winter and sort of cold population, were the Ukrainian hit to continue in that direction. This is just the beginning. It's not just like you attack refineries. Refineries are just the first step, right? Then you go through all the various ducts. You go through also the same fuel stations. You're truly crippling gradually the entire mechanism, and in ways that are practically impossible to replace. I would like to stress this, that part of the Ukrainian hits, as you know, are very calibrated. They are very precise, surgical, and this also shows how advanced their technology has become. The Flamingos, for example, that were hitting pretty rarely in the first attacks are now falling exactly on target, right? There isn't just Western intelligence, there is basically even the possibility of jamming the traditional way, meaning that these missiles and drones use AI to strike, right? So this is ever less alterable. These things are going on their own without guidance either. So this is incredibly no human guidance, no direct guidance at a distance. So this is the future of it. Whereas the Russians can get there, but as we explained before, they can hit much less because they just don't exactly know what where to hit. All right, and I talked about this especially in the last episode. This is going to go methodically, and aiming at disrupting as much as possible. And the refineries, for example, because this is the point, Ukrainians do not want to kill Russian civilians, right? As we'll see now in the wild berries bombings, they actually did kill people working there. But that's also because it's such a massive facility that was fundamentally unavoidable. But the Ukrainians do not want on Russian news to say, I don't know, 6 children were killed in their attack, because their entire point is showing, as we've seen also with what they, the negotiation proposals that advance to Russia, that they want to make the Russian people understand that if they get rid of Putin, they can almost sort of get away with all the war crimes the Russians carried out. So this is very interesting, and that's something, again, in a single video, I'm sorry I throw all this stuff into it, but we can't descend in depth, but I just have this amount. I could dedicate the entire channel to the war in Ukraine, but let's say we need to be compact and saying the meaningful things. So, for example, for refineries, Ukrainians just strike some areas that are very sort of small compared to the whole complex, and that, however, are critical for properly the entire treatment of oil. And that requires pretty important pressures, sort of very sophisticated machinery, and you can't simply repair, right? Also, Ukrainians have like an energy grid that is completely disrupted this year. That they're actually escalating, partially attacking. I read this evening they're attacking Moscow. Moscow is currently under attack because they want as much hits in summer for deflecting the hits in winter. They know the Russians just have limited missiles, so they say better now than later, right? And the interesting part is that you can't fix this stuff, right? If you strike refineries there are certain components of that are made in the West, and they're the only ones available. The Russians do not produce them. No other country can give it to them. And so they're effectively damaged, and the Russians themselves do not know how to, even on which terms to fix, right? Or which also temporal terms to fix. It is incredibly easy, right? And Russia, in this sense, is incredibly exposed. And all this aims, obviously, at some general popular outrage and sense of sort of betrayal and powerlessness from the government and so on. Paradoxically, Putin is holding back like escalatory demands, right, so far. And he can't only, like, it's in a pathetically weak situation, also probably a dangerous one. As I said before, there is a chance, of course, that especially the imposition of a mobilization at this point cannot grow from the usual means, and the prisons are empty now. Right? There were some detainees that waited for months in really before being able to be sent to the front, because they wanted to do that, and there were so many that they couldn't simply send them all together. And now there is nobody else. They all finished, right? They're all done. They're all dead, and so this mobilization should hit on. You remember how many Russians fled the country. There are some preparations for this. Further censorship, certain borders shut, like from months, gradually, creepingly. Different terminology, different postures. Peskov used the term, this is war, and etc. This all points to mobilization. I'm reading, reports that give this to be announced probably shortly. That's why I was also saying things are going to fundamentally escalate before they de-escalate, as a matter of fact. And this is the bare minimum. Bare minimum hits for maximum damage. I would like to stress again, in strategic terms, it's not like Russia is losing for this reason. This mechanism, this dynamic can indeed create some malcontent across the country, can maybe bring to regime change, etc. But per se, it's not like how you simply knock Russia out of the war. Like you're making, as you've seen on the ground, all this effort to be ever less sort of effective. Even mobilization that would require people sent to the front just in 2 weeks of training is just basically going to jam the entire system further, to weaken further the already very poor quality of the Russian military. So it's something really very interesting to witness, wasn't it? So tragic in so many different ways. There is a parallel targeting of major civilian logistic platforms now that were repurposed for military sustainment, sometimes undercover. This is the case of the wild berries, right? We have this extensive warehousing networks managing camouflage netting, body armor components, optical devices, drones, sub-assemblies. And striking them has generated cascading disruptions, including recent strikes on facilities of major retailers integrated into supply chains. These hubs, once insulated, became valid targets after insurance policy changes around early 2026 and incorporation to state direct networks, as exemplified by wild berries. This is basically the Russian Amazon. Imagine somebody attacks like the largest warehouses of these things, and Amazon does not work anymore. And just imagine the kind of damage that this brings, right? Especially for a society like the Russian one is not particularly affluent, and that feels much more crudely any sort of fluctuation, and especially at this point, net loss. Right, there is all a history behind wild berries. It was created by a housewife, right? This was a massive Russian e-commerce enterprise founded by Tatiana Bakalchuk, née Kim, as a matter of fact, from modest beginnings, reselling German surplus clothing in the early 2000s in a classic post-Soviet entrepreneurial story. It expanded into Russia's dominant online marketplace with trillions of rubles in annual turnover, handling vast consumer goods distribution before militarization through complex oligarchic maneuvers involving Ramzan Kadyrov, yes, longtime Chechen leader with influence over security structures and paramilitary forces in the south of Russia, and Suleiman Karimov, the influential Dagestani billionaire, senator, and investor. These guys hate each other's guts, right? And this essentially statal takeover started with was caused by a 2024 Moscow shootout at headquarters from the bands of these two guys, essentially in time caused by corporate control disputes and enforced equity transfers. A long story. We don't have to digress on it. It's linked to a Rus outdoor merger that folded military supplies like drone components, camouflage, and dual-use logistics into its warehouse network. And that's why Ukrainians now consider this a legitimate target as well, which it is, right? And so when you we've seen the pictures of these massive destructions, you realize that the stock losses for military and private vendors are staggering. There are secondary economic ripples across the pain and small enterprises, and exposure of how internal Russian power struggles legitimize targets magnify disruptions far beyond the battlefield as well. Right, this is hitting really average Russians in their economic aspirations and or sort of habits, at least. We're talking a damage of multiple billions of dollars for a country like Russia that has the same GDP of Spain, right? It's staggeringly poor living conditions, and indeed also a much larger population for these resources to be more necessary and valuable. So this gives you an idea. This is just the beginning. So like Ukrainians have just begun for less than a month, and they're not going to stop. And the more Russians escalate, the more Ukrainians are going to strike and feel legitimized as such, right? What about Crimea? Well, we were hinting at it before, right? There are some efforts persisting against airfields supporting bomber sorties, power generation plants aiding occupation infrastructure, and naval facilities in Sevastopol, supplemented by Mediterranean interdictions exploiting choke points in Russian shipping through the Turkish Straits. I mean, at this point, technically, Ukraine can even attack the Russian fleet in the Pacific, right? There have been attacks, for example, from quite surely from some former Soviet republics. Like if you look at the Kazakh border with Russia, it's enormous. There's really nobody there, right? We can't even check, right? And on top of this, the Kazakhs want to gradually autonomize themselves from Russia. They may have given a green light for these maneuvers, right? So easy to arrive there with a drone and operate in it to hit very specific points that at this point, Russia is truly a colander, right? And Crimea is fundamentally the same, right? Crimea is at this point more logistically strained, as it's highly dependent from the mainland. Fundamentally, the Crimea is an island, if you think about it, and that's where Ukrainians are applying this gradual but constant pressure to gradually grind, properly local resources and will of the population to stay, obliging the Russians to bleed from a propaganda, from a political, from a material point of view, without being able to de facto do anything about that, right? And showing ever more like the unlikeliness that anything is going to get better there, right? These Ukrainian campaigns utilize advances in fiber optic guided drones resistant to radio jamming, satellite enabled drones for beyond line of sight navigation, artificial intelligence assisted routing algorithms optimizing paths around known surface to air missile sites. And when they don't want to target those, by the way, and iterative targeting refined via multi-domain intelligence fusion of satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and human resources. They're fundamentally different measures compared to the ones, for example, that are employed at long range, right? Ukrainians, in this sense, are experimenting with a very wide range of assorted means depending on the specific theater. They're definitely interacting a lot. There's definitely American, British technology, intelligence involved, but this is essentially just assisting a Ukrainian industry that in the field of drones is radically advanced and incredibly flourishing in Ukraine right now, right? So coupled with Western assistance, this is really providing with incredible means. Here we're not making the general political reflection on how, of course, the Westerners are giving green light to Ukraine for gradually escalating, right, in a contained fashion. There is no doubt that this has been sort of the case since the beginning of the war, right? The Americans decide more or less what is right, what is not. Of course, Ukrainians have their own pride. They handle matters their own way. And there are some aspects of sort of post-socialist countries that are really impenetrable, right? But we are really witnessing in the last months, in particular, this ever tighter interaction, ever more direct, unitary direction, especially as the general sentiment, of course, the general center is that Russia is in ever dire straits, and that this is definitely a situation to capitalize upon. These campaigns impose costs that Russian electronic warfare assets like Krashuka and air defense systems, including the S-400 batteries, have difficulty neutralizing fully at scale due to saturation attacks and decoys, right? The SAMs are not, as we were saying before, replaceable. They're being increasingly shifted toward Moscow, and they're really running out. Simple as that. Those are not things, they're not assets you can immediately replace, nor you can replace in any useful time, the foreseeable future at this point. They're going to be destroyed more than they're going to be produced. One can only imagine what the Russians are trying to find as a solution, that is to say, to properly stem all these drones that are pouring across the front, for which there is no way to stop. I mean, probably there are technological solutions, etc., but Russia in AI does not exist. Ukraine receives the best AI support from the West. It has all the means to implement this, so it's practically impossible for the Russians to do anything in order to stop this raid, so to say. Russian forces encounter corresponding limitations sustaining high-tempo Donbas operations that require this continuous manpower inputs that are equally unsustainable. This was true for both Russians and Ukrainians. This is not sustainable over time. There is probably going to be a breaking point at a point, but this is not in sight either. So at that point, it's just more people that you kill, more moral responsibility that falls on you. Recruitment signals, including declining interest, even among penal contingents where earlier amnesties once attracted long queues of prisoners seeking freedom through service, indicate, as we were saying before, eroding appeal amid visible casualties from drone strikes and limited rotational relief, leaving units in the field for extended periods without rest. This admittedly was the case since the beginning of the war, the latter part, but the fact that there aren't quite so many people that you can also find outside the sheltered core of the Russian, the ethnic Russian Western sort of part, like the most sort of people from Moscow, St. Petersburg, etc., is living without many options. Interestingly enough, Russian propaganda has adapted with more repetitive, lower fidelity messaging coinciding with reported internal purges and reassignments, potentially impacting information operations and cognitive personnel. Elite, you can see it even just from social media, right? There is less sophisticated bots, right, that are sort of more aggressive. It's strange because it's as if there were more need for emotional effect on the audience. This is not to say that they're just losing their mind. They just want more attention, right? And putting the matter once again on the scene, because it seems like in the West, in fact, as we don't really care that much about Russia per se. We just are content with supporting Ukraine and doing so as Ukrainians are succeeding. We should have done definitely much more. We could do ourselves much better. But this is definitely maybe the reason why. Because it's not like Russia propaganda is, say, as dumb as it is. The only dumber people in Russian propaganda are literally the ones who actually believe in it. Right. If you look at Russian propaganda itself, they do not actually spread the same level of. So they're very easily intelligible in a way. And if you read, as this is my always my advice, if you read what Russian military bloggers write, it's all very open, very accessible. Right. You can't see what is effectively expressed by part of fellow Russians in different parts of the world as a literal lie that not even the Russians believe. Russians will believe anything, but say those with more cognition of cause and are following the war, obviously they're telling you the bare minimum, right? That's what I've never really understood about people who seem to use the internet as having themselves heard because they lack something in their life. Like, if you want to make a point, like if you want to be listened, say something intelligently. Even if you're partisan, do something that sort of puts some effort. Nobody cares about your opinions or having to address them if they're, basically uninformed. If they literally do not even begin to understand how this thing works at the basis, as the basic that even Russian military bloggers that are also propagandists can actually tell you very clearly. It's a sort of, this is the fatherlessness of the mind, like the orphanage of human dignity, right? The idea that your fantasy world has to be real because, I don't know, you just feel like that. Only fatherlessness explains this in a deeper, indeed also familiar societal sense, but in a metaphysical, spiritual sense, right? Without virile principle, there is no human dignity. That's why this works well with communists and other people who root for inferior cultures. All right. Now, elite frictions, such as patronage networks affecting logistics contracts and command appointments that favor loyalty over competence, in all this, obviously always compounded in Russia inefficiencies in supply chains, already burdened by corruption and sanctions. Duma-level talks of radical leadership change noted by prominent bloggers like the same Igor Girkin, Strelkov, the former, so that's what I'm talking about, the former Donbas militant leader critical of Kremlin strategy since 2014, point to growing domestic pressure as well. Because if someone like him can discuss this, right, there are so many veils that are raised at this point. Although Russian artillery and glide bomb employment from the Sukhoi, the Su-34 fighter bomber aircraft support localized gains via the FAB munitions with stand-off glide kits, Ukrainian countermeasures, including electronic jamming of guidance, mobile air defense teams with man-portable air defense systems and short-range surface-to-air missiles, and precision counter-battery fire with Western howitzers raised the expenditure needed per incremental advance. Right, the FABs had been used in the past years to basically just pave the road for Russian, for trying to unhinge, right, Ukrainian defenses. This mechanism has been partially countered through these means, right? There isn't a way to simply stop that, but those bombs actually cost, right? They're not infinite. They can be used just on sort of restricted pool of targets, and as we've seen, like, you can't properly dislodge a Ukrainian sort of unit from its position simply through that, right? Fortification is something very complex. The scattering, like the deployment of troops is, as we've seen, this front is even ever more ever less dense, so to say, ever more rarefied, right? So even the expandability of these single hits are surpassed by the much more capillary drone employment after all, right? And this is especially true in urban or fortified settings where drone persistence counters traditional mass advantages through constant overwatch, right? The interplay of ground-holding actions and strategic interdiction shapes the current equilibrium. Ukrainian forces sustain cohesion via doctrinal adjustments, favoring, as we've seen in the first part of the video, preservation of experienced cadres through improved rotations and training, rapid integration of commercial and indigenous unmanned systems from first-person view kamikaze drones to larger strike platforms, and fortified depth that trades space for time to attrit the attacker. Russian strategy holds initiative thus in the select Donbas sectors, right? Not entirely the entire line is enormous. It's incredibly long. But undergoing strain, in fact, from disruptive sustainment caused by deep strikes, exposed rare areas open to raiding, and cumulative effects of a battlefield where technological asymmetry increasingly sets the tempo through superior Ukrainian drone innovation. This is interesting because, let's say, there is a limit to this as well. When we were, say, weeks ago, there was this also news, like these figures about how many trucks Ukrainians blew up in the corridor of Zaporizhzhia, the one reaching Crimea, along the main coastal roads. 1,500 trucks. If you actually are told how many drones were used, there was actually a lot of drones, right? Something much more effective was done by striking the outs of fleet, fundamentally, the civilian fleet. So it's not like drones, by sort of commanding certain operations, are simply able to win the war per se. You need someone seizing ground as well. And so the point being, Russians are facing massive logistical issues at home. They are going to nothing but worsen. In this sense, they can allocate resources for the front line, but these are also suffering from all the problems, plus further supply strains that in any case are going to occur as a consequence. The entire system is gradually slowing down. It's not immune, in spite of the best efforts from general sort of weakening. And all this in international scene, as we've seen, tends to actually see but at a strengthening of NATO, Western partnership. This was very important with at the summit in Ankara that strengthened European cohesion and long-term Ukrainian integration into defense ecosystems, including licensing for domestic Patriot production paired with optics collaborations to tackle immediate interceptor shortages, while situating Ukrainian industry built on inherited Soviet-era expertise in aeronautics and rocketry, because they made it in Ukraine largely at the time, for post-war relevance within Europeanized NATO structures. In fact, one of the most important aspects here is that there's not much like people complaining, even on Twitter, saying, but Trump gave the license for Patriots. He had argued that he hadn't even ever talked with Lockheed Martin, etc. But it's going to happen. But the point in that the fact that again the first missile can be created only in a couple of years at the earliest. This is not the point per se, aside from the fact that there are these assets that are going to be invested in Ukraine, etc. But think about what Ukraine, first of all, the confidence in the fact that Ukraine not just will win the war, but that in this sense will be able to defend itself and to do so from a position that they have started sort of creating their own equivalent for Patriot as well. They have the thing is going on. And by the end of the war, as far as also a European umbrella defense, like the fact that this stuff is ever more European based and that Europe is definitely confederating in some more robust military system and beyond, is definitely an incredible step forward that these meeting NATO summit in Ankara in particular is sort of quite unequivocally showing, right? The development of the Baltic air policing toward air defense modalities with delegated engagement authority to operational commanders at sites like Ramstein is also interesting because it tightens rules of engagement against Russian overflights and boosts collective deterrence on the eastern flank without needing political approvals for prompt responses. This is incredibly important, probably underrated. Baltic countries are constantly, also Poland, telling us that basically Putin is up to some kind of escalatory move to test NATO resolve. That would be also a way to politically distract from the disaster that is happening in Russia and in the Ukrainian front line. Say Baltic countries are, and rightly so, perhaps more alarmistic than other countries, but these reports are, we have no specific doubt to think that are wrong. As much as the pressures on Putin that we described before, even within probably from the Russian establishment, real. There is no doubt that the energy factor alone is going to escalate toward autumn, that mobilization is again likely in sight and basically almost confirmed, right? It's interesting how this all ties with the general Western pressure, the U.S. rearmament, today's news of the $1 trillion that are the United States are rearming, which is also a very, very good news for that matter. We're expecting yet another escalation against Iran that naturally must be punished in civilian infrastructures as long as it continues to go on with this failed war. And so in general, like when you look at the overall picture, this is, remember when people say, oh my God, it was over, NATO was dead, now everything will collapse and society is done for, and the Russians have, do you realize how much less of a person someone has to be to even morally believe this? Like if you have any basic understanding of what happened in history, you know that this is just a joke, basically, and that, we are especially not getting much of a punishment. We're maintaining our lifestyle. The only problems that we have are exquisitely, say, factional in terms, especially of immigration policy. For the rest, we're building up, and we're also shifting. We're tilting toward the right further, just more than we have, and not towards, again, an isolationistic, populistic, sub-personal kind of direction, right? On the contrary, we're heading towards an imperial, truly Catholic, global dimension. And of course, if we manage to give this a traditional character, we are definitely able to navigate toward much better places. How does this end, right? There are many ways this can end, right? Because escalation is obviously possible, but it's not possible without indicators of such direction, and there are many, right? Escalatory policies, even in nuclear warfare doctrine, are incredibly layered, right? The notion from a day to another you wake up with nuclear holocaust is pure fantasy. Besides, there is increasing pressure along every step that is exponential. So in the current situation, sort of much different scenarios, not necessarily, say, they're hopefully less dangerous, yes, as a whole, like there is no other competitive way to see it, but not particularly predictable. Well, I mean, the one is regime change, as we've seen, is sort of the most obvious, but the point is also what happens to the social societal collapse, because if you think about Russia collapsing in some sense, you have to think also of some further pressure with immigrants to Europe from the eastern part of the continent. It's all and so people that are also completely incapable of understanding what the world is, not just specifically the West. It obviously is the antithesis of their metaphysical value, but let's say that are hostile and resentful and sort of distant, typically, paranoid, sort of Soviet paranoid type, that is sort of he's a very specific streak of mental illness with very specific psychological indicators and behavioral patterns. But it's also like how they can start there are some stories about veterans that have come home in Russia that are literally terrorizing the local population. And these people are, you know, let's not comment on it, but let's say you can imagine where I'm going with this. And so it's incredibly fascinating as well from a sub-anthropological standpoint as well to witness to this. Indeed, so what can mobilization bring to the table? Well, without that, or external resource flows, just shifts in Western aid volumes that are not going to practically change, the trajectory points to continue high-cost Russian pressure countered by adaptive Ukrainian resistance calibrated to exploit enemy vulnerabilities at extended ranges. Even if some country, there are only few countries that care about that success that can lead the support of Ukraine, and as we've seen, there is no change in posture toward that, as much as there is actually a greater and incremental interest in investing in Ukraine, as we've seen at Ankara and beyond, as of course, like massive investments flow, where of course the more successful side goes, right? And especially in this case, also because Russia is effectively cut off from the rest of many transactions. China has deserted some of the talks, the meetings for the construction of massive energy infrastructure across Siberia. So they're really going down. In a way that is difficult to describe into, again, the complete distraction of Russia's collapse. This is not likely going to happen. Like, we don't see that, but definitely a situation that can force, like, a political change regarding the war in Ukraine. Then if, again, something can happen. There can be some social rifts opening that we can't imagine. Of course, there is going to be some massive social malaise and sort of all problems deriving from that, further escalating a disaster country like Russia. But in general, right, it's just enough for the war to end. Like, mobilization can bring on the table what? Right, other 500,000 soldiers to do what? To seize Donbass in how much? Like 2 years? 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and then you need more troops than that. And then what? Like, you're hoping, obviously, that Ukraine collapses at some point, but the question is, how's it gone so far? Right? Why do you get ever more losses with much less conquered, and with increasingly sort of escalating fallout at home in domestic affairs? Like, this is definitely not how that is going to go. This seems like just a moment in which, I don't know, some singularity is expected by Putin for just to stay afloat, buying time with mobilization. That is one of the things that he actually tried to avert as much as possible. This is a real problem, right? That's why there are all set of directions this could take, and we've seen, as we said at the beginning of the video, an acceleration in the presence of these black swans throughout this is unpredicted as unpredictable events that are, however, cascading ever more importantly in one direction. And so this dynamic honed through command transitions and procurement discipline enables Ukraine to maintain defensive integrity while gradually complicating Russian operational coherence across domains. It embodies, as we've seen today, the culmination of long-running tensions originating in Zaluzhnyi's era, advanced by Fedorov's anti-corruption drives, and now embodied by Drapati's reformist vision. Overall, the war reveals a pattern where Russia's tactical gains in the Donbass, often measured in hundreds of meters amid fierce urban and elevated fighting, incur costs that Ukrainian deep operations and command reforms increasingly offset through systemic erosion of Russian sustainment. Ukrainian strategy refrains from directly copying Russian mass tactics, instead harnessing innovation in unmanned systems, precise targeting, and leadership accountability to generate cumulative attrition. And although Russian forces retain localized pressure and numerical edges in certain corridors, the qualitative movement toward Ukrainian initiative in rare disruption and doctrinal adaptation indicates a path favoring sustained defense and strategic exhaustion of the aggressor, provided reform momentum and external support continue amid the war's protracted and technologically intensified nature. And this is the point. Like, if you can't basically alter the battle space in a fundamentally expandable way, which is partially sort of happening. There is some change and increase in this sense, but say there is a symmetry, a tendency to it. Like, the Russians expand their drone capability along the front line where that asymmetry gap is bridged the most, right? But if you look at it in the rear, if you look at it in domestic affairs, Russia is paying a disproportionate price compared to Ukraine. And the Russians do not have, in the moment, a clear pathway to exit this loop. And so even the entire issue of attritional warfare in strictly strategic terms is basically giving way to literally like this war is starting being lost in a political sense. As I said at the beginning of the video, I'm not making the case that as just to repeat it now, that we're clearly seeing how the matter is going to, we can't predict, if anything, how the matter is going to settle, especially as rumors of mobilization are increasingly confirmed. The question is, this war is going to go on again, but again, also at which cost? And so at that point, the other big game changer, regime change, and or some escalatory move that here is difficult to discuss, and that's why I dedicated this video mostly to the Syrsky Drapati thing, right? Because of the most obvious change, improvement in pace of Ukraine for a strategy that at least on paper works better than one that Syrsky had pre-activated. We'll see now whether this drives home, right? But we've already seen it in action even before the exchange. Now with all these Ukrainian deep strikes into Russia, and so I think that the next months are going to be tumultuous, to say the least. That we're really going to see some of these issues these knots to be, if not entangled, but let's say to be encountered to a point where the comb can sort of go further. Not much strategic consideration, because probably, again, had I made this video a couple of weeks ago, I would have fundamentally sort of addressed the Ukrainian strikes with greater depth and the general picture. But this is the general picture. Like, the fundamentals, again, of the war haven't been significantly altered from a strategic standpoint. They have been significantly altered from a political standpoint, right? Western support has sort of gracefully gracefully strengthened compared to the already strong one that it was. There is all a set of signals, so the role of Turkey in all of this, that bailed out, for example, of the Russian anti-aircraft missile technology for the Western one, because Western technology works. Russia gradually losing any. They never had really a competitive edge, but say anything that it could produce, again, in a structurally relevant sense, for example, to reform their military or whatever for any possible offenses, I don't know, in Caucasus. Good luck with that. When the war was over and the Ukrainians ship, all their drones over there, including their operators and whatever. And so, again, this is where things get really interesting, and we'll leave to see, if anything. What to say overall? Not more than much. Like, there is just so much that we can know, and there's so much of what is going to likely happen in the sort of immediate future that we can somehow relatively easily predict. But always stay tuned for the unknown. Always stay curious and hungry and sort of healthily skeptical. Like, skepticism is really a bad thing per se, but being skeptical simply so is important to understand. Especially narratives are not fundamentally or necessarily there for being objective. Remember that, right? And what I try to do on Schwerpunkt is heading instead toward that direction by default, right? So these videos are always very dense. I'm really glad, obviously, enough to make them because they're really unique in their kind, and they are relevant in as much as they sort of follow one another. They sort of, at this point, sustain one another. I can't remember anything that I said that eventually did not accord itself with the following developments. The point being, however, that war is complex to understand, right? And so it's actually a simple affair to deal with as a whole. People tend to make it more complex than it is, right? It's complex to learn about, to exactly dismantle your preconceptions and to see at the core of it, right? If military analysts did, say, in the information space, so to say, in social media, more of this exercise as opposed to react for engagements to this or that event, I set this series for 2 months, right, at a bi-monthly pace, also because not too much was changed. If were there more important things happening, obviously I would cover them with greater frequency. But I hope that you understand that my work is entirely tied with the wall of itself, right? This doesn't say, if yesterday, for example, I talk about 13th century Castilian warfare, that has a meaning with today, Ukraine 2026. Like, it's not random. It's not part of another world or another meaning and so on. So we will be able to see this better, if anything, in another video. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.